Chillcast MMA. Alright, what's up, guys? Welcome to the podcast, Chillcast MMA. You can find me on Twitter, as always, at Nixon_speaks. And I just wanted to bring you guys sort of a special, different episode this time. Thanks to all you guys who subscribe to me on YouTube and read the articles and stuff and share my content. I really do appreciate it, because I'm sure you guys know it's hard trying to get any type of original content out there, so I do appreciate it as always. So I guess if you like this, I'll leave my contact info below in the description. You can hit me up if you have questions or something specific. If you guys don't hit me up with something specific, I'm just gonna assume whatever ideas I'm coming up with is cool, and I'm just gonna roll with that. But I have some interviews lined up for you guys as far as fighter interviews. Gonna bring you guys different interviews as far as media members, different people within the MMA circle. So like I said, again, just like, subscribe, share, and stay tuned, and just let me know if you guys want to hear something specific. So this time I just wanted to talk about, because it's the end of the year, 2019. We're almost there, 2020, and everyone's getting their end of decade list, end of year list ready. And I just wanted to talk about sort of the year in review. Everyone's sort of doing that, and so a lot's been on my mind as far as what's been going on the past year in MMA. I'm just going to sort of stick to one or two topics and just deep dive into them, as opposed to trying to list 6 or 7 and jump all over the place. But what's been on my mind over the past year, and the thing that I've been keeping an eye on the most, just because I'm a little bit more familiar, anyone that knows me knows anyone that knows me knows I'm a music producer. So being as though I have to work with these different platforms, like YouTube, SoundCloud, and Spotify, and the different premium outlets, it's like over time, you start to get used to these things as far as monetization and advertising and analytics. And as far as MMA was concerned, for the longest time, that wasn't really relevant to the conversation. It was always important because we expect fighters to market themselves. We all say that. And fighters, they're fighters, right? And we get frustrated with fighters when they try to dip outside of that too much as fans. But they market, and they usually, hire any, from manager to PR firm, you name it. Those are the people that they surround themselves with. Same thing like how I said in music, the same way as a producer. Sure, you may have a viral moment, but sort of sitting back and hoping and praying that happens, that's few and far in between. You don't really see any type of real progress until you surround yourself with people that can help you get to the next level, because they know something that you don't. And it's sort of the same thing with fighting. Obviously we can talk about training and things like that, but just as far as from building your brand, everyone says that. It's like they throw these terms out, but we often don't really have a real conversation, because up until this year, 2019, we didn't really have to have it. This was more of this is on the fighters problem. And I'm a huge person, obviously, like I said, for probably the 3rd or 4th time, so I'm going to chill out from now. But again, I come over from music, so I sort of had that perspective of just how things work. When you work with different artists, you have to try different techniques. Not everything is going to work. Some do, some don't. So it's like you see the different techniques and you get used to the different terminologies. And this year, because the UFC, everyone knows who that is by now, I don't have to deep dive into that, and ESPN, they signed their deal, and that went into action this year. And a lot of big money was doled out to the UFC, and they had to put on some cards, and we have a nice batch now. Back in February, when we were only on the second one, and it was the UFC For the Laser card, or it was UFC Brooklyn, it was hard back then. I tried, for anyone that followed me, I tried to get interviews with different media members, like John Nash of Bloody Elbow, to just sort of talk about that relationship and what we thought was going to happen with that, as far as start times for cards and what did this mean. And Bellator, for the UFC, this was sort of a matching the energy they were sort of already putting out. This was WME's big move, and, all eyes were sort of on them. The one huge positive piece of business that they had for this year that we got to see play out over time. And Bellator did the same thing, and it had different results for them. And we saw boxing, they're dabbling into it. And so the conversation as far as analytics and marketing, it's becoming more important. I don't believe that this is something that we can just sit back and, just talk about pay-per-view numbers, because now we're talking about subscription rates. When UFC Brooklyn went down and Henry Cejudo fought TJ Dillashaw, after that, ESPN was going around touting that 2 million number. And that was huge, but you often didn't hear follow-up reports as far as how many did they retain? How many did they convert? Where did the 2 million come from? And those are all questions that if I'm a fighter, and Derek Lewis, I guess, for anyone wondering, like, sort of like where's this all coming from, or where's an example of a fighter being aware of this? I think Derek Lewis, to my knowledge, is one of the only ones in a roundabout way that asks about it or brings it up in conversation. Like, if you listen to any of his interviews over the last year, anytime he's had to fight on ESPN, he usually brings it up like, so which platform are we on? Like, don't we get paid for that? Don't we get a percentage? And the answer is no, because, and we don't have to go into that, but unionization efforts and things like that, collective bargaining. You guys don't have a CBA with the UFC or with ESPN or anything like that. There just isn't one at all, so I don't even have to try and be specific, but it just doesn't exist. So, with that being said, it's like, the conversation is starting to gear towards what fighters can help drive subscription rates. What fighters are people going to log on to? And we're going to get into all of that as far as like the logging on and how that's affecting the bottom line and what do we see moving forward and things like that. But the truth of the matter is, and other promotions have jumped on too, such as, you have the PFL, they signed on with ESPN, and Kombache Americas and KSW. So there's other promotions out there that are doing this as well. So I don't mean to, and everything I guess that I'm about to talk about does apply to all the promotions involved, because they're all going digital now. They're all going digital. We're seeing a lot of sports do this, and I've often said, anyone that knows me, I feel like this is becoming a bigger discussion because music has gone through this. And I feel like in certain ways there's so many similarities, and I'm going to keep beating this drum. I'm hoping, you guys listening, like I said, I'm not that hard to, get a hold of. I'll try and leave my contact info anywhere I can. But I just feel like, as far as MMA is concerned, it's like we went through this with music already. We know how this is going to play out. Tidal's a music app, and they paid out big money. If you look up, if you know any indie artists or anyone that has had to monetize their music on a premium platform, Tidal is big. Not so much for TV or anything, because they're not necessarily into that, even though they do provide video sharing services. And, they have to deal with that as far as how they charge for bandwidth and things like that. But with Tidal, one of the biggest things with them was their library. That was one of the biggest things, a part of the discussion. And now they had to raise the price, basically, or the price got raised. And now people are starting to flood the market more. But then on the opposite end of the aisle, you have places like Spotify and iTunes, YouTube. And so questions of monetization and what is all this content worth, and people have ad blockers, so how do you get paid off for that? And everyone's trying to figure this thing out together. Music already went through this, and I'm not going to rehash all of those points, but you can look all of that information up. And I feel like now we're starting to see the same thing in MMA. I often say the whole JC thing, and I guess because he's a hip-hop head, obviously, and I don't know why I just use that word to describe Jay-Z, but he's a hip-hop figure. And I guess because it's me, or for whatever reason, anytime I bring up the name Jay-Z, people just instantly tune out the rest of my argument. But I'm going to keep saying it because I think he's the most glaring example as to how this UFC ESPN deal is going to play out. And it's been a year now. So like I said, back in February, this may not have been part of the discussion at all. But I feel like now after a year, you can start to talk about this. So what are some of the correlations I'm talking about? With Jay-Z, when he signed a deal with Sprint, so that way and this was a couple years back, like 2, he had a huge rollout for his album, and Sprint basically paid for 1 million copies, so that way if you had a Samsung phone, you basically got it if you had a certain version. And it was a huge thing, like, oh, he sold 1 million copies before his album was even released. and it was a huge to-do, and everyone fawned over it, and, oh, is this going to be the new wave of music, like people doing moves like that? But what you also saw is that the burnout was really high from that. Like, yeah, a million people may have it, but are a million people going to keep it? Are a million people going to listen to it every day? Things like that, to get that sort of long-term payoff that you're hoping you get when you pay for an album like that. And I feel like I'm sort of starting to see the same thing with the ESPN and UFC deal, where because it is so easy, because it's people can pick and choose now more than ever. When the fights were only coming on Spike, Paramount Network, and on Fox, and they were easier to find, it was, and streams online for the smaller promotions that would stream their stuff on YouTube. Like, multiple promotions would do that, or TKO, that's a kickboxing promotion I follow and they're based out of Japan. They stream their fights on Periscope. But now this move over the past year to switch to premium digital and put a paywall and everything, it's making people pick and choose. So while, yes, ESPN, just like with Sprint, they did front a lot of money for these cards, but is everyone watching it? Sure, everyone tuned in droves, and obviously they added pay-per-view behind that, and we can talk about the buys and if that's hurting it or not, but it's just one of those things where that's you have to start thinking about that. When you put $5 and $10 and you spread it across 2-3 different apps and everything is not in-house, and you make people pick and choose, and there's fights going on sometimes, and even though you have to pay for this app, no one thinks that the majority of the content that you really want and are hoping for and you're paying for, it only takes place 2-3 times out of the month. On a Saturday, usually when there's a fight going on, maybe, there's a hot weekend where Bellator and UFC has something going on. And that's usually about it. And I don't know if that's necessarily the payoff that you want. I don't know if that's the type of activity that you want when you sign over close to $500 million, when you hand over $30 million to a Bellator. I don't know if that's the type of traffic and subscription model that you can sustain over time, because people will pick and choose. How many people that signed up for the free first month? How many people that signed up for the free first month, that ESPN, that number that they touted, the 2 million, how many people stuck around for February, for March, April? How many people signed up for the year? That's sort of what I'm talking about. And if you're delivering premium content, sort of like Netflix, because this is the area we're sort of heading into, if you have premium content, people will stay subscribed. But if you have cards that are lackluster, it's easier now more than ever to just disregard it. And you could say, oh, well, it's only $5 a month. But for some people, something that small is a make or break. It really is. And I'm sure if you've talked to anyone online, you know what I'm talking about as far as, oh, why don't you just pay for it? Or why do I have to pay for this? The Athletic was another huge move over this past year, where we're seeing MMA media head towards the premium zone now. And one of the first things you heard was, oh, I'm not paying for that. Why should I have to pay for that? And it's like, I'm not sitting here saying it was right or wrong. I'm a subscriber. I think they put out premium content, especially if you are interested into other sports, live play-by-play, things like that, updates. I think they do a great job, and they've assembled a good team. They have podcasts, the whole thing. But at the same time, I can see why people didn't want to pay for it. MMA is becoming monetized now more than ever. It bleeds your pocket over time. And I feel like that's not too crazy for me to say. And I feel like over the past year as well, there have been a lot of indicators that this can be bad and this can be good. One of the things that one of the things that I noticed over the past year, more so over the past couple months, say 2-3 months, is that with the NBA season, the ESPN pays for some of the NBA rights and they have some of the games on. But I noticed that last year with the Toronto Raptors, the guy Kawhi Leonard, he's a basketball player. For anyone out there, he plays for the Los Angeles Clippers, which just so happens to be my favorite team. And this guy Kawhi Leonard, he goes out there last season. He has the load management. He's coming off of a injury, He's coming off of an injury year where he didn't play that many games the year prior. And they praise this guy, Kawhi Leonard, because he goes out there and he's able to win a championship with the Toronto Raptors. And everyone on ESPN, they're praising him for it. But now this year, now he plays for the Clippers, and a lot of their games are going to be nationally televised. And I mean, they are. And he's had to sit out a couple of them. And ESPN's not too happy about that, and some of their talking heads have acted as a medium to sort of let that be known. It's been well publicized because of them. And I sort of wonder over this next year if we sort of see the same activity where subscription rates, they fluctuate a little bit. MMA fans, yes, they'll subscribe, but are they clicking on the other content? If this is heavily geared towards us, because it feels like it was, right? Like when DAZN first rolled out, and now you're hearing talks about NFL and MLB and getting some of these other rights. Now you're starting to hear that conversation. But again, like I said, in the beginning of the year, when this all first started, everything seemed like it was geared towards MMA. After a year of information gathering, analytics, looking at those numbers and metrics, I just wondered, is ESPN, how are they feeling about MMA now? You know, is this going to be a situation where next year, if some of the same things as far as, you know, the lawsuit, the UFC antitrust lawsuit, which is only being reported by, you know, a small amount of people like Josh Gross over at Forbes, John Nash, Bloody Elbow, Victor Cruz, MMA Payout, those guys and others like Josh Gross for The Athletic. And they all do a good job reporting and trying to put it out there, but it hasn't really caught steam. And if it does catch steam, I wonder how ESPN reacts to that. Because they're trying to make money and keep their name clean too. And I just wonder if the heat starts to rise on that. If this starts to become a bigger story than what it is now, will their tune change? I don't really know. But it's going to be something to keep an eye out over the next year. And I think another thing that we have to keep an eye on is Bellator. You know, I don't want to just make this all about the UFC. Bellator is going through this as well. And some of the things that I'm about to say with them and DAZN, I guess they can apply to the UFC, but much less. It just feels like with Scott Coker, he took over the helm in 2014, and it's the end of 2019 now. And there's been like small little hints here and there with Scott Coker that feels like some of the hardcores, people that are the deepest into MMA, they're starting to get a little bit ticked off. Like everyone, you know, it's just frustrating because every time you bring up the names, Scott Coker, you have to, you know, hem your conversation with, oh, he's a good guy. We know he's a good guy. We know about Strike Force, but it also closed up shop too. And I'm not saying the same thing is going to be with Bellator, but it's like people have complained about Scott Coker, and it feels like this was one of the first years in a long time where people are starting to change their tune a little bit on Scott Coker. And part of that is because of this DAZN thing. When you get $30 million, you have to sort of get ratings and numbers. And like I said with the UFC, you have to push subscription rates. And if you think that doesn't affect matchmaking on a grand level, I mean, you're just mistaken on that. Sure, you may get $30 million, but you got to pay that back. Which brings me to Exhibit A for this, MVP. We all know he took his first loss in Bellator to Douglas Lima this year in May. And I'm not going to sit here and just re-harp and get on him about that. But again, you follow that up with back-to-back fights over who? And again, if this was the UFC, and even with, I know he has a fight booked for the future, and it's against a former UFC fighter, and I get that, man. But still, you understand what I'm talking about. When you have to pay it back, it's like, I get it. MVP's a name, so you just trot him out there against pretty much whoever. To his credit, this year, he's actually been barking ever since that loss. He's trying to get that one back, and he's trying to get some of these other fights. But the fact of the matter is that they're not being made. They're just not being made. And I don't want to sit here and call him a can crusher, but it's been years now. It's not like this is his first or even second year. And it's those sort of little things. You know, some of the free agents was all the rage. UFC fighters going over to Bellator, that was all the rage last year. And what do they have for it? What's happened to Ben Henderson? What happened to Ben Henderson? What happened to Phil Davis, Rory McDonald, Gegard Mousasi? I don't want to sit here and say, oh, the UFC was right. That's not what I'm trying to point out by saying that. What I'm saying is some of these things, we slowed our roll on Bellator every single time. They have a nice stretch of fights, and they put out some good PR. We sit here and we say, Bellator, you know what? Maybe you guys are starting to nip at the heel of the UFC. And then just as fast as we start to say that, they follow up with something where we have to instantly rethink it. But this time, it feels like it's starting to become a stretch, and we're starting to see it a little bit more. And I think a huge part of that is because the DAZN, they have more demand. And yeah, they're trying to get more rights. And then, now this is going to segue back to what I was talking about with both of them when I said it was going to be a little bit more negative. And there is some positive. One of the positives, I think, is ease of access. If you actually are willing to pay for all of these things, you can pretty much watch a fight whenever. But I think also because of that, the value of watching live, it goes down. It doesn't matter if I watch the fight live, if there's 30 different versions of it, all in HD, all on Twitter and Instagram as the fights are going down. It's like I don't have to miss a thing. I can watch the 2-minute clip of the finishing sequence on Twitter, scroll up to the top, and then give my thoughts on it like I watched the fight. And because everyone has a delay, hey, it doesn't even matter, right? That's where we're at now. So the value of watching things live and paying for it live, I don't know about that. And even though the $5 price tag, it isn't that big. And if you pay for it, they have a lot of other content. Once again, if you're into other sports, so it's a nice buy. But again, just little problems. No one individual thing that I'm talking about here is going to come off like a red flag. No one individual thing is going to set the house on fire. But I feel like when you look at all of them together, there are some questions that we're going to start to ask. Music had to go through this as far as analytics and what is the true value of content. You know, when people pay for ad placement, which is something that the UFC obviously has to deal with, when they pay for that, what are they actually paying for? How much is that worth per stream? And again, if you have an indie musician, I can tweet and put some of this stuff out and put some of my own information out, so I guess you guys can get a slight comparison. But again, with YouTube and highlights, people had this idea that if millions of people saw it, that converts to money. Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Not when you have a company of over 300 employees and a roster of close to 500 fighters. Having a YouTube page with highlights on it where 3 million people might have seen it, but by Tuesday they're not going to forget it. I mean, having a video up where it has 3 million views is nice and dandy, but it doesn't mean anything if by Tuesday people have forgotten about it and the monetization doesn't equal out to what it really should. And again, the whole reason why I brought up Tidal in the beginning was catalog. ESPN Plus is kind of dealing with it. Yes, when Contender Series is rolling and they're putting on nice fights on the weekends, that's grand. But when UFC is off and there's no Contender Series and you just realize, oh, and by the way, did I forget to mention Fight Pass just over there in the corner? Not to mention, if you watch the fights live and have been a long-time MMA fan, which is what, you know, if they are asking people to sign up for this, this is what they are expecting people to see. This is what they're expecting people to watch. But we've already seen it. We've seen it 30 different times before the end of the fight card. Someone gets knocked out, we go on our various social media platforms or forums, and we see 50 different versions of it before the next fight even starts. We're not paying attention to the ads. And these are the problems that they have to face. Because if you're a fighter going to them, you have to come with your analytics. And, you know, what do I mean by that? Your conversion rates. When you tell people I'm fighting on ESPN Plus, how many people actually convert from that to actually search you? Good, you know, are you trending or not? Things like that. They look at all of that and they hold it against you. When you're upset because you've been on a 6-fight win streak and you feel like you deserve a title shot, they just dive right into the analytics and they just use it against you and say, no, you're not worth that re-up. And so they just let guys walk. Now, on the positive side, one of the things that I said, again, is ease of access. If you have it, you can pick and choose what you want to watch. That being said, habits change. Little things like, oh, what time is the card on? If Mike Perry is the third fight on the card and the card starts at 8 o'clock, then I know, all right, around 9:30, he's probably going to be fighting around then. So I got some time. I know what I'm doing. All that is out the window now. Cards are starting earlier, which means if people have stuff to do, they're just going to go do it. Habits change. And again, like, this has been a year. If this was January or February, that's not too much time. So you can't just make statements like this. But now after a year, I'm just saying, I'm just noticing. I'm taking the temperature of the field, and I'm noticing it. People still watch the fights, but watching it live, habits are changing as far as that's concerned. And I understand that there's people over there in Europe, and I don't fully understand as far as what's going on as far as the BT sports situation, but that's something else to monitor and keep an eye on. What happens with that as habits change throughout the next year? Because once it just happens, there's sort of a hoopla around it, but you don't really see the effect of how it changes behavior or little things you can notice until you give it 6-7 months. Then you can notice it. Then you can sort of talk about what are some little things you notice here and there. And I'm not sitting here as some sort of expert or some online media guru. I'm just someone that since 2013, I've had to deal with some of these tools, and now I'm seeing MMA enter into the same space that music is, because everything is starting to be online. Everything is about, can you monetize it? Can you get ads on it? Can you get people to subscribe? Can you get people to like and share? How are your analytics doing? You set up marketing plans. You hear everyone say that you have to have a marketing plan. Market me more. Well, these are the things you're talking about. And it's a double-edged sword because you make yourself more open. People can hit you up a lot easier. And MMA has been historically, compared to the other sports, a lot better about that as far as letting its athletes, direct-to-consumer contact and things like that. And when you go to these different networks and you ask for the re-up, that's what you're hoping. People are watching it live. And they're subscribing and they're staying subscribed, even if your content's not there because you have a library that's extensive. Title faced these problems. DAZN is facing these problems as far as their price fluctuate. And that didn't take long at all with them, Bellator and DAZN. And then, again, another thing that I noticed, and like I said, no one thing, but my hope is that if you look at all of these things put together, but another thing is, at the beginning of the year, they were getting more fighters on there and this and that, but there's something to that, man. Just like if I have a record label and I have 5 artists on it, sure, I can try and rotate them out and this and that, but if I'm only trotting out the quote-unquote big names, what are they going to see everyone else as? Okay, they must be second string. And I feel like MMA fans, we got duped a little bit because we had unfair expectations because we didn't fully know how ESPN works. We kind of thought everything's going to be on ESPN. Everyone's going to be on the car wash. Everyone's getting interviews, that whole thing. Not necessarily. It's been tepid. They give us the same sort of content we've always had, but it just feels a little bit tepid. And I wonder about that because Disney has Disney Plus now, and ESPN is under that umbrella, and they have to push subscription rates, and they're looking at analytics. So I just wonder, when you talk about leverage and fighters having to argue this stuff with their management team, truly how stacked is the deck against them? These are sort of conversations over the next year I feel like we're going to hear a lot more about. And to be honest, for anyone, this is my long way of saying that if you're worried about fighters trying to pull stunts and get out there more, it's only going to get worse. Because you got to get buzz now. That's the name of the game. Everyone's trying to get paid. Everyone's trying to get heard. So it's really only going to get worse. That's just the truth of the matter. Sure, you're going to have some people out there that stay quiet, keep their head down and grind. And we should treasure those. There's no reason why Demetrius Johnson should get traded. But that's for a completely different discussion. But this is just sort of what I'm talking about. It just feels like the more content you get and you bring in-house under that Disney umbrella, as ESPN expands its digital platform and brings more sports rights on, what happens to the UFC? Sure, it's a part of the daily diet now, the daily sports discussion more than it ever was. But if you start getting more NBA games, NFL games, more college sports, MMA can get lost in the shuffle a little bit. Whereas when ESPN Plus first rolled out, I remember when Contender Series was streaming live, it was one of the only things they had in their library that was streaming live, that was a part of their catalog. And so you brought in a lot more MMA fans. Now, granted, like I said, Bellator, DAZN, the UFC with ESPN, they marketed their apps heavily towards MMA fans because we're the ones that are willing to pay for stuff the most. I mean, if you want to watch live NFL content and live NBA content, it's not that hard. MMA, though, you're probably going to have to pay someone to watch something. Even if it's a wrestling match, all the way down to now with the MMA media and to read articles and catch certain people's podcasts. So it's easy to tune that stuff out because, again, you have to pick and choose. If I pay for this over here, then by default, I'm saying I don't want to pay for that over there, so I just miss it. Sure, you can stay up to, tune on social media, but if you're paying for one, you're saying you're not paying for the other, and by default, that's an entire library you're missing out on. That's what these promoters have to deal with now. And so picking and choosing, that's going to be something that I feel like, start to hear more. And also, just like in music, I wonder if you'll start to see more fighters start to drop their management more. Because if you realize that all your management is trying to do is get you sponsorships, and in order to do that, a bulk of nowadays, because everyone's trying to get online, if a bulk of that is all social media and you can drive that yourself and negotiate it yourself, which most people can, and they have the clout to, especially if you're in the UFC and you have that blue check mark next to your name, someone's going to slice you a check for something. And so you've seen a couple fighters this year start to drop their management, like I do believe Holly Holm did. And so that's going to be another storyline to keep an eye out on. And like I've said multiple times, I don't believe any one thing is going to set the house on fire. But all of these things, it means more changes on the way. And another thing to keep an eye out on, this is going to be my story to watch for the next year, the outfitting policy, Reebok. We're going to start to hear all of these conversations come up again, just like how they did in 2015 and 16. That's going to start to come up again, and we're going to have to start to talk about that. And what does that mean? Should there be an outfitting policy? Does there need to be one? Who should it be? Under Armour? Nike? Does Reebok re-up? If so, for how much? Should Reebok re-up? If so, for how much? Do the fighters get a part of that? Will they finally unionize this time around? These are all questions that, once again, they're going to get rehashed because the outfitting policy is up in 2021. But as we sit here now at the end of 2019, first half of December, that's my story of 2019. The walking into the digital era. Analytics, numbers. You see them more in other sports, and you're starting to see it now in MMA, and it's becoming more important, but just not analytics as far as how fast can you punch, how many strikes do you land per round, or how many submission attempts do you have. Not those type of analytics. What type of subscriptions do you drive? Because big checks got cut to these promoters. So now they got to get the money back. And in order to do that, they need the fighters that you're willing to log on for. Which means you need to know about when they're fighting. Which means they got to go on social media and get word out there and do interviews and things like that. All that stuff is becoming more important now than it ever has been, because now it's directly tied to subscription rates. So now, as far as, oh, do you have a choice? Not so much. It's unfortunate. If you guys had a CBA, I'm sure this would be different. But as of right now, it's not. And so these are just some things that have been on my mind as far as what this past year has meant. And I'm going to do a follow-up episode where I talk about, just some more things as far as it's concerned. But this was just a general take, give you guys something to get back into it. And I just want to know, what are you guys thinking? Like I said, I leave my contact info below. As always, you guys can find me on Twitter at Nixon_speaks. Once again, it's on Twitter, Nixon_speaks. And let me know what you guys think. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Let me know. But just to basically recap and dumb it down, I think that because subscription rates are needed now, the fighter's worth, as far as this monetization and trying to get this money back that ESPN put out, their social media and the content they put out is at an all-time high. I think fans can pick and choose now more than ever. It's easier to follow MMA now than it's ever been because there's so much content out there. Everyone has to put it out on a regular basis because they have to keep the fans that they're asking to subscribe, they have to keep us engaged. So it's easier to pick and choose now. This is great. But because of that, the value of some live content can take a dip. Content and libraries. This is also huge. Are you willing to pay $10 a month, to just watch grappling matches? Some people are. If you're into jiu-jitsu, wrestling, Krav Maga, judo, things like that. Places like Flow Grappling, the Flow Network. That can appeal to you. But if you're paying that, are you also willing to pay $10 a month for DAZN? On top of $12 for Fight Pass? On top of $5 for ESPN Plus? If so, then that's fine. And that goes back to what I just said. More content for you. But if not, that means you're missing out on content. And if you're missing out on content, are these digital platforms, are they okay with that? And I don't think they are. I don't think they will be in the long run. And it's going to be interesting to see, however, this next year, the attitude towards that from their side of this, how that plays out. It's been a year for everyone. Now I feel like we're going to start to see habits, and as far as how they treat the product, MMA, now it's their time to react. We've had our time to subscribe, and all the info and data is in. It's been a year. Operating costs and all that are calculated. And now that it is, and we know who's going to watch what when, I feel like over the next year, it's going to now be ESPN, and it's going to be DAZN's turn to respond to our activity. Our habits are now going to dictate how they deliver the product, I feel. So, alright, that's it for this one. Like I said, you can find me on Twitter at Nixon_speaks. Leave my email, contact below. You guys can contact me, whatever, if you have a specific topic or fight, breakdowns. And like I said, I have interviews lined up, fighter interviews, other media members. So I'm going to try and switch up the content and give you guys something fresh each time out. So, alright, that's it. Alright, again, like I said, Nixon_speaks, contact info below, and I'll see you guys later on in the week.